Oh, thanks, Michael.
Can you guys hear us? Okay, this is the part we always have to tweak a little bit. We've gotten feedback in the past that you can't hear us so well. So remember that you can type in questions.
And I have a screen here that is pulling up questions, and I'll be able to insert them into our talk throughout the afternoon.
So we'd like to welcome you here and to talk a little bit about why we're doing this talk. This came as a result of a questionnaire, I guess, that was put out by the Family Home Visiting Coalition. And it turned out that toxic stress was the #1 topic requested. So, we've talked about trauma before, and we've talked about resilience and ACEs, and it still came up as the thing people wanted. So what we've done this time is to...
Can you go back for a second, Carol?
Yeah.
What? I think that quote is so good. The quiet child is not a content child.
Yeah.
So anyway, I just wanted to pull that up.
You know where that came from?
No.
That's from an article in the New Republic about children who are in orphanages.
Oh.
And about how one of the striking moments that the researcher had was walking into a room full of kids and hearing no noise.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's something that we think about a lot, is how do we understand what stress looks like in very young children,
mm-hmm.
especially kids who don't have parents.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, thank you.
Michael's making a water delivery.
Yes.
Thanks, Michael.
So should I move forward?
Yeah. And I'm assuming people can hear us okay. We're good?
Well, we're not going to know for a while.
Okay, yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, if we're flagging in our voices, just somebody send a question that says you're getting too soft.
We have this little device between us that looks like a Star Trek early model Enterprise, if anyone is a Star Trek fan like I used to be. So we have to lean over like what would be the top of the bridge.
Used to be.
Yeah. Okay. So this is in response to the survey, but also we're aware that there are always new people starting in the field. And we know you get lots of training in school, but sometimes once you get out in the field, it looks a little different. It's what you think of as high stress or home visiting stress. So that's why it's coming up now. If you've heard us talk before, you'll hear some themes are familiar. For one, that this topic is both old and new. Mm-hmm. It's new in the way it's being referred to. The term toxic stress is probably about 10 years old or so. But the idea that development has been compromised by stress is an old one.
And I think that the toxic stress phrase, I think, is a framing kind of issue, right? I mean, this is an old phenomenon mm-hmm. that as Carol's slides will show, has been around for a long time, and people have been thinking about this for decades. And I do think it's a way to kind of package it for an ear, right, that gets policymakers and practitioners and parents listening differently. So. Which goes back to the slide on the quote on the slide when the concept of disrupting brain circuitry is much more compelling than the concept that poverty is bad for your health. The packaging idea, yeah. Mm-hmm. Which again fits with the research, right? We know a lot more about how the brain develops now. Yeah. It's not just packaging. Yeah. And that's the thing about the people that we're referencing here. These are MDs that were interested in early institutionalized children when the rate of survival was 0 and the rate of infant mortality was 100%. And they were marveling at a phenomenon where kids are fed and housed and dying at 100% rate. So that stress, that development was compromised was known, but the pathways were not. So we're going to talk a little bit, just a very brief, a little bit about stress as a field of research. But first, just current concepts in toxic stress and development, the stuff that people are writing about now. Oh, Michael's back, so hello, Michael. Okay. Goodbye, Michael. So the 3 current topics that people are really referencing a lot. Chronic adversity in childhood has serious implications for health in adulthood. So that would be, if anyone's listened to the webinar about ACEs, that I think it was Jane Ellison and Michelle Fallon did, that one is coming up a lot, that
that once it became that adults are affected and the bottom line for businesses are affected by adult consequences, then the interest in early childhood has been more, yeah?
Well, and it fits in with the whole kind of healthcare reform piece, right, of really understanding that in order to get some kind of control on later life health issues, that there has to be some attention early, right? That those of you who are familiar with that research, you can pull up almost any kind of physical malady that adults experience: hypertension, diabetes, obesity, smoking. I mean, all of these health-related issues, and they all increase exponentially related to the amount of, or the number, literally just counting them, 1 to 10, the number of adverse childhood experiences that someone experienced. So I think that again has gotten traction with that here.
That, and also one of the questions people had been asking was, okay, so those are lifestyle illnesses. What's the mediating factor between the early childhood experience and these lifestyle illnesses? So we're going to be talking about that today. So that's the ACEs stuff. The second big concept is about epigenetics, that environment affects how the genetic blueprint is put into action. So we're born with a certain genetic blueprint.
Yeah, like blueprint. Yep.
And then which genes are turned on, which genes are turned off is related to what we experience. So we're going to...
In the environment, and I always kind of berate this a little bit, but isn't just the kind of physical environment, right? So it's not just your surroundings or your physical surroundings. We're also really thinking about your experience of the environment, which is often mediated through relationships. So we're putting relationships now right in that intersection, right, between how we experience the environment and then really how that impacts genetic expression.
Yeah, and that's right where these early observers were so puzzled, right? They got enough food, and then one of the movies we're going to be referring to, one by Renee Spitz, he actually says this in the text, that all of these children are given enough nutrition, they are being cared for, and they're still dying. And so that relationship part is not just incidental, it's so crucial to actually what happens. So epigenetics we'll be talking a little bit about, but it's not the focus. These are all too big for us to do in a 2-hour webinar.
On them themselves.
Yeah, but we wanted to at least acknowledge what the current issues are. And then the third one being this developmental neuroscience, the idea that the brain architecture, actually literally how many neurons, how strong the connections between neurons are affected by stress, are affected by experience in life.
Mm-hmm.
So now that we said the big thing, let's bring our lens in a little bit so that we can just get closer. For today, we're going to talk about the stress continuum. On that continuum, there's one area called toxic stress, which is what our focus is going to be and what it does to brain development. So all the way from, how the neurons connect, how it affects the way the brain structures, how effective they are, which means how it alters the developmental outcome.
How they form, really.
Yeah. Yeah, and the strength of the connections. And then what we know, or what we can imagine, is the relationship between toxic stress in development and then parenting. And then, of course, there's us. There's people that are going into environments where there's a lot of stress and how it affects everybody who's listening, including the speakers. You want to say anything? No, just go on. Okay. So, stress research started a long time ago. It wasn't called stress. It certainly wasn't called toxic stress. But so I'm going to talk a little bit about this guy, Hans Selye, who, from what I've read, was kind of an interesting, quirky guy. Spoke 8 languages fluently, and then apparently he spoke some other ones, but maybe not as fluently, And he was a young researcher, so one of the guys down the hall had isolated a certain neurochemical, or not neurochemical, just a certain chemical. And his task was to figure out a research project. So he took the chemical and he was going to inject it into rats But, he's new at this. He hadn't done this before. He picks up the rats. He tries to inject it. The rats run away. They hide behind the barrier. He pulls them out. He does it again. Turns out, once he was able to inject them, they all developed these ulcers. Mm-hmm. So he was so excited. It's like, okay, I figured out that this particular chemical that was isolated from something in the body, causes ulcers. So then he did his control group. So he did the same thing. He got these rats, and again, not so experienced, so he's picking them up and he's shooting them up with chemicals, and they're running and he's chasing them around the lab. Turns out they developed ulcers. Mm-hmm. So luckily, he was observant enough to realize this was not about the chemical. It was about something in the process created something.
The handling and
the fear, who knows, so he also noticed that his patients who had all kinds of other illnesses had what he was calling a general adaptation syndrome. Mm-hmm. Just something wasn't right. They just weren't, something was off. Mm-hmm. And then it would show up in these various illnesses, which now is what we call the stress response system. Mm-hmm. So in his work, he demonstrated that persistent stress would lead to disease in animals that is very similar to the stuff that we now see in the ACEs studies.
Mm-hmm. At the physiological level.
At the physiological level, yeah. But only in animals. There was no demonstration, no causality that could, when we have the same problem with humans, we don't use humans as test animals.
Right.
And at that time, there wasn't a definition of stress, and I've read a couple of different accounts. Sapolsky says he wasn't the guy that named stress, but so apparently he later regretted he called it stress. He would have preferred the term strain because stress meant something else, but stress is what we got. Mm-hmm. So he defined it as the non-specific response of the body to any demand for change. Well, that's pretty vague. Mm-hmm. So one of my other favorite comments is a critic of this guy's work who says, so what you're saying is that in addition to being itself, it's also the cause of itself and the result of itself. So
stress upon stress upon
stress. Yeah, stress is stress, and it causes it, and then it causes stress. Right. So not too great a definition for this critic. But I also want to point out this drawing here, which was done by Salvador Dali for the second International Symposium on Stress in 1979.
1979.
Yeah. Huh. So, there's a long history to thinking about this. That starts in the 1930s. Now it's 2015. We're still trying to get our mind around what this thing really is.
Although to think that actually the kind of understanding of that word prior to that really didn't include this physiological aspect to it. In the 1930s, that's a long time ago, but not that long ago to kind of think about as a phenomenon that it's kind of floating through the culture. It's interesting.
Well, and just the ways that people observe different phenomena. Mm-hmm. Yes. So do you want to talk about this one?
No, you can go ahead.
So many of you have heard the name René Spitz, who was a doctor in the 1940s, who was the first guy that took a camera into orphanages and just filmed what he saw. There's a very well-known one, the first thing listed on the slide, Grief, Apparel, and Infancy, which is a silent film. It has some cards that have words written on it, and then it just shows infants in orphanages whose development is so compromised.
So remind me, these were some of the fondling homes?
Yeah.
Right? So, again, you're thinking this isn't, Star Trek, this isn't ancient history, but there was a period of time when women who had babies outside of marriage were incarcerated, and their babies were separated from them, and they were placed in these fondling homes. So I think he was doing some of some of his observation in that kind of setting.
I think in both, yeah.
Yeah. So again, just to kind of think about, again, that's maybe to some of you that's ancient history. To those of us who are a little older, that's not terribly ancient history, but that was a public policy decision, separating and punishing women who had had babies. That's just part of the history.
Yeah, and you punish them for being bad mothers by separating
them from their babies, so that's punishing their children too. Yeah.
So out of his observations came a few terms that mean similar things, not exactly. So one is hostilism, the condition by which you watch babies not develop. So again, the understanding of the physiological process of why is not there, but the observation of a phenomenon. And marasmus is a term that's used that just generally means lack of development because of malnutrition. So we see that in countries where there is food scarcity. It was interesting that it was used in this context as well because they were fed. They had enough caloric intake. And then the third term we hear currently still, the non-organic failure to thrive. So there's failure to thrive that's based on a metabolic issue. There's non-organic failure to thrive where, again, it's an observation of a phenomenon, but there isn't built into the term an understanding of why. People now know that for many kids who have non-organic failure to thrive, when they're removed from the home in which they are and placed into a different home, they rapidly grow.
And their bodies begin to metabolize the calories that are available.
Right.
But prior to that, they're not able to.
And so that'd be the question of why, if the calories were available, you couldn't metabolize, and then you can later. So we're going to keep those in mind because the research has really come a long way from this period.
Well, and these were pioneers too, right? I mean, they were early observers of phenomenon that were very troubling and disturbing, trying to get a handle on it. So it's good to kind of place them as really, these leading edge thinkers at that time.
And disconnected. They're coming from different fields. You get the psychologists, you get the MDs, you get the educators. They're coming from different viewpoints and observing a similar phenomenon. So then we move fast forward to the 1990s.
Pictures look remarkably the same, don't they?
Yeah, they do look remarkably the same. And the only difference in the more modern ones is that they're in color. But you see the same kind of bereft look on kids' faces and the lack of development in the brains. So Romania, 1990s, and today, where we see the similar look on the faces of, and I'm talking to people, preaching to the choir. You guys who are listening, I'm guessing, except for maybe people who started 2 weeks ago, have observed what this looks like in the face of kids or in the grown-ups once the kids have gotten big enough.
Yep.
So we've got some definitions. One is from Megan Gunner, who is a very well-known researcher at the U. Stressors are events or conditions that threaten or are perceived to threaten physiological equilibrium. So you'll notice this idea of equilibrium or balance shows up in people's definition of stress. And Robert Sapolsky, who we quote quite a bit today, talks about it as a stressor is anything that knocks you out of homeostatic balance. So they're vague, but there's something about being right with oneself physiologically, right? Something that your whole system has to struggle to get back in once you're knocked off.
Oh, and we all know what it's like to be out of balance, right? Or what is it when you're in your ear? I can't think of the condition.
Vertigo?
Yeah. I mean, just kind of thinking about how
literally out of balance.
Right. So just that, then to think about applying that to this idea of stress, of how unsettling it is, right? To be in that state. I don't know, there's something nice about framing it around balance, I think.
Well, and also that phenomenon that I'm sure we've had and other people have had where you think there's going to be a car accident. Your car, the brakes don't work or something, and your whole system, gets all mobilized, and then it turns out you don't hit anything. And then you watch it
come back down
because you're not hurt, and you can observe all that stuff, and then you watch it come back down. So we can feel what it's like to get back into balance.
Yeah. It's kind of physiological.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, and I think lots of people are familiar with this. 0 to 3 has done a lot with this. The Center for the Developing Child at Harvard has lots of slides about the stress continuum. And again, I think it's a way to try to calibrate stress across a range, and really acknowledging that we all need some stress in our lives. You need stress in order to develop, and it's part of motivation. It's part of growth, and so you can't go through life, you can't develop, you can't move forward physiologically or developmentally without some stress. And then as you move up the stress continuum, we're talking then about dose, so increases amounts of stress. But the other thing that's introduced in this continuum then is the presence of relationship, of somebody with you. Primarily when you're young, an adult or your parent, who is providing some kind of mitigating force around the stress, and allowing you to cope with it. So then by the time we get to toxic stress, now we're looking at the dose is higher, and the presence of that buffering adult, that kind of mitigating relationship is either absent or diminished in some way. And now we're into that physiological overwhelm.
You know, what you're reminding me of is that one experiment that was done at well baby clinics. Do you remember where they have a...
That's Megan's.
Oh, that's hers? That's her research.
Yep.
Okay, so from what I remember, help me if I don't get this right, she asked parents to take their babies to well baby checkups, which included shots.
Mm-hmm. Right, just your regular baby.
Regular.
Yep.
And they did attachment assessments,
mm-hmm.
and they noticed that the babies that had secure attachments with their providers were screaming their heads off, but their physiological arousal was not high, that the cortisol level, which they measured through saliva, had not gone up.
Right.
The other babies were also screaming their heads off,
right,
but their arousal was physiological.
Right. So something's happening at that below behavior physiological level, right? And it's not that you're crying, but that you're crying and you can count on somebody through your history that you know that they're emotionally available and responsive.
It's like you're crying out of protest. Like, really? Whereas the others are crying out of distress.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Despair.
Yeah. So I always keep that one in mind as that tolerable level, that it's shots still hurt.
Right, you got to get them.
Yeah. So there's...
Well, I'm sorry, Carol. It also makes me think, just in the consultation and supervision we've done with home visitors, at least in the settings where I've worked, where we have the flexibility sometimes to accompany parents on a doctor's visits, just those, and how many times the parent asks the home visitor to be in the room and to hold the child. And that the idea of the child going through that kind of stress is overwhelming to the parent, and how hard we work to kind of redirect the parent, right, to be the one, and then the home visitor kind of holds the parent, parent in place, right, so that the child's really getting the message that the parent can be with them through the stressful experience and turn it into something that's tolerable. Yeah.
Well, I also love the idea that you hear that in consultation, because then you're kind of there for the home visitor who's doing the same thing for the parent who's doing the same thing for the child. And I do think we hear from people who don't have a place to go to talk about how hard the work is, how it starts to feel not tolerable.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So we all know that experience.
All of us who are parents remember going to those visits. They're stressful.
That too, yeah. Okay, so this is a show on National Public Radio called This American Life, which is a radio program. So there are some visuals that they've included in this, but it's kind of a summary of the overall picture of toxic stress. We're going to be deconstructing it, but we thought this would be a useful and also kind of entertaining way of getting the larger picture.
And I'm just going to remind people that there is some kind of question box or something that you can be typing into if you've got any comments or questions. And I'll try to fold them into our talk, but just want to remind people that that's available.
But in addition to all the bad things that are likely to happen to them as adults, there's also the effect that long-term stress has on them when they're still kids, especially on their brains and their ability to learn.
If you look on the molecular level, you're walking through the forest and you see a bear, right? So you can either fight the bear or run from the bear. That's kind of your fight or flight system, right?
Right.
And your body releases a ton of adrenaline, right, which is your short-term stress hormone, and something else called cortisol, which tends to be more of a long-term stress hormone. And this dilates your pupils, gets your heart beating fast, your skin gets cold and clammy. That's because you're shunting blood from anywhere that isn't absolutely necessary to the muscles that you need to be able to run from that bear. The other thing that it does, now you can imagine that if you're about to fight a bear, you need some gumption to fight that bear, right? So it kind of shuts off the thinking portion of your brain, right? That executive function, cognitive part. And it turns on the real primal aggression and the things that you need to be able to think that you're going to go into a fight with a bear and come out on the winning side, right?
Yeah.
And that's really good if you're in a forest and there's a bear. The problem is when, that bear comes home from the bar every night, right? And for a lot of these kids, what happens is that this system, this fight or flight response, which is an emergency response in your body, it's activated over and over and over again. And so that's what we were seeing in the kids that I was caring for.
When the brain does something over and over and over again, it creates pathways that get more and more ingrained. So this kind of repeated stress affects the development of these kids' brains. And especially affected in this situation is a specific part of the brain that's called the prefrontal cortex, which is where a lot of these non-cognitive skills happen. Self-control and impulse control, certain kinds of memory and reasoning, skills they call executive functions. If you're in a constant state of emergency, that part of your brain just doesn't develop the same. Doctors can see the differences on brain scans. Dr. Burke-Harris says that for these kids, the bear basically never goes away. They still feel its effects even when they're just trying to sit there quietly in English class.
And if right at that moment someone asks you, could you please diagram this sentence? Or could you please divide two complex numbers? You'd be like, what are you talking about? And so that's what we were seeing in the kids that I was caring for, is that a lot of them had a terrible time paying attention. They have a hard time sitting still.
And you hear about this in lots of schools. Head Start teachers in one survey said that over a fourth of their low-income students had serious self-control and behavior problems. Nadine Burke-Harris says that it's true for her patients, the ones with adverse childhood experiences, like neglect, domestic violence, a parent with mental illness or substance abuse.
For our kids, if they had 4 or more adverse childhood experiences, their odds of having learning or behavior problems in school was 32 times as high as kids who had no adverse childhood experiences.
So, put some context to who she is.
Yeah.
So she's a pediatrician who maybe some people know. She's established a clinic in San Francisco. You're the San Francisco person?
In the Hunters Point district in San Francisco, which is known to be a place of stress, low income, poverty.
And I think I was hearing that there was no clinic in that neighborhood.
Clinic, yep.
Yeah, so she very boldly placed her clinic in that community and then began her practice kind of treating all the common childhood illnesses, but was very frustrated that children didn't seem to be responding to her care in the way that she had hoped. I think she got particularly intrigued about the number of kids who were being diagnosed with attention deficit disorder in particular, and began to do her own research, stumbled across the ACE study, and wove it into her pediatric practice within that clinic, where they're offering both healthcare services but also embedded trauma-informed treatments like parent-child psychotherapy as well.
And so you'll see at the end of this talk there's a reference for an article about her that was from 2011, and that's in our reference section. Okay, so what we thought we would do, well, there we go, is to review in slow time some of the things that happen to our systems when we get stressed. So the first thing, we have two parts. One is the immediate reaction. So the first response to a stressor is very just immediate, where the adrenal glands, that's when you think the car is going to hit you and you get that rush of adrenaline, which throws a series of cellular switches, they call it, throughout the body, where your heartbeat and your breath start to get quicker, your blood pressure rises, you release stored glucose so that you get energy, your blood flow, as she mentioned, some of this is diverted to the major muscle groups and to the brain to sharpen your thinking, but not to appraise. You're not thinking about what kind of car or how much that car.
That would all be the executive function,
Yeah.
right, that she mentioned in that.
And then key for us to think about with the families that we work with is that the energy and the blood flow are diverted away from digestion, from growth, from tissue repair, and reproduction. So that starts to help us think a little bit about why is it hard for people to grow and develop when they're under stress. So that's your immediate response. So here's a little schematic for people that prefer visuals.
I like that bear drawing better.
I like the bear. We like the bear.
Kind of imagine that.
Right, right. So all kinds of things prime us to run away from the bear. And then the second part happens, where there's activation of what's called the HPA axis. So that would be the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, and the adrenals are all responding to the adrenaline and to this shock that sends out hormonal signals to activate the sympathetic nervous system, which in the literature they talk about that the activation is like pressing on a gas pedal, and then the sympathetic nervous system is what slows the stress response. So you'll see references to the gas pedal and to the brake. So if the brain gets this bunch of signals, something's dangerous happening, then the hypothalamus and the pituitary release hormones that go to the adrenals, and the adrenal glands release cortisol. Once we get cortisol in our body, the body is in high alert, and all, that whole sense of everything being primed, and when the threat passes, the cortisol levels fall. That's the piece that the doctor was saying is supposed to happen.
Right, right. This is the adaptive response, right?
When the bear keeps coming over and over again, that parasympathetic nervous system responds.
Well, and particularly, right, when you're little, and those pathways are developing, right? It's kind of the pathways that get used, right? It's those pathways. What's the Bruce Perry quote? What fires together, wires together,
Yeah.
right? So what we're trying to do is embed this response then in a developmental context where the child's very systems are developing at the same time. So you develop a really good gas pedal,
Yep.
not so great of a brake.
Yep.
Right?
Yep. And then we get, no. So I got to take a break and ask Scott, should we play this one or should we keep going? We had thought about 2 videos and we wondered about time. Scott says yes, so we get a second video. That
If you don't like it, I didn't say that.
Learning to deal with stress is an important part of healthy development. When experiencing stress, the stress response system is activated. The body and brain go on alert. There's an adrenaline rush, increased heart rate, and an increase in stress hormone levels. When the stress is relieved after a short time, or a young child receives support from caring adults, the stress response winds down and the body quickly returns to normal. In severe situations, such as ongoing abuse and neglect, where there is no caring adult to act as a buffer against the stress response stays activated. Even when there is no apparent physical harm, the extended absence of response from adults can activate the stress response system. Constant activation of the stress response overloads developing systems, with serious, lifelong consequences for the child. This is known as toxic stress. Over time, this results in a stress response system set permanently on high alert. In the areas of the brain dedicated to learning and reasoning, the neural connections that comprise brain architecture are weaker and fewer in number. Science shows that the prolonged activation of stress hormones in early childhood can actually reduce neural connections in these important areas of the brain at just the time when they should be growing new ones. Toxic stress can be avoided if we ensure that the environments in which children grow and develop are nurturing, stable, and engaging.
Just those people that maybe sometimes are asked to do presentations, these are nice. I mean, that they're stock kind of things that are available on the internet. They're good to use.
Yeah, and these are all from the Developing Child website. So what we wanted to do was to think about some of these phrases because they packed in an awful lot, such as, even when there is no apparent physical harm, the extended absence of response from adults can activate the stress response system. This is a hard one. It's been a hard one for the system to integrate. It's hard for our diagnostics to understand because we don't have a category that fits for not having stimulation. We talk about symptoms, but the idea that a highly stressed system is in response to the absence of something isn't part of how we usually think.
So it makes us think about separations in a very different way.
In a very, yeah. So the second one is that constant activation of the stress response system overloads the developing system. So if the stress response system is set permanently on high alert, then we think a little bit differently about what intervention means. It's not, we talk about this intervention continuum from promotion to prevention to early intervention, but if we're talking about a parent who was a child who was set into high alert, now they're parenting in high alert. So what kind of intervention do you need? So that's something else for us to think about. The idea that neural connections that comprise brain architecture are weaker and fewer in number, that's going to come up again. The idea that the repetition in some ways strengthens those pathways, but in other ways it burns the circuits out. That there's one thing that I was reading about and trying to understand was that if there's too much cortisol, it causes the release of too much calcium, which if you remember from physiology or your biology courses, the calcium-potassium channel for action potentials, and they talked about if there's too much calcium, it just fires until it dies. So it's one hypothesis, I think, about why those neural connections actually fade. And this is at a time when instead of reducing neural connections, the brain's supposed to be multiplying and strengthening those connections. So in lots of ways, this gets embedded into the body. So, too much cortisol, what we know now, damages the neurons and dramatically reduces the rate of manufacture of new neurons. And this happened particularly in the hippocampus, which affects memory, right? So it affects the retrieval of memory as well as storing memory. But it does the opposite on the amygdala. So instead of it shrinking or reducing the creation of the neurons, it activates the amygdala because it has both the cortisol releasing hormone and the receptor, so it sets the feedback loop where out comes the hormone, then it's picked up, and then out comes more, and then it's picked up, and so...
So would it be too simple to think about, I'm always trying to get reductionistic on this stuff, that the amygdala would be more the gas pedal, like the emotions, right? And then the hippocampus, our executive function, would be a little bit more of the brake pedal?
I would say they would say the prefrontal cortex becomes the brain.
Okay, I'm sorry, right, yeah.
Yeah.
But are those functions,
Yep.
the executive functions are really more the brake pedal.
Yep.
You want to be able to think about what I'm feeling. So if I feel too much I'm all gas.
I'm all gas.
Yep. Okay.
Yep. I think that's exactly, and we're going to see a couple of diagrams that try to spell that out. I mean, as you said, we try to reduce it so that it makes sense in our minds as schematics. And I'm going to tell you, just going through the literature, you need a schematic because it's so overwhelming. Mm-hmm. But I did like this this quote of Jack Shonkoff, that it's in this way that a child's environment and experiences get under the skin. Mm-hmm. We're not talking about, when sometimes we hear people who aren't as embedded in early childhood say things about children's choices. Like, he didn't make a good choice that time. We're thinking in terms of activation and patterns and arousal, and it's very different from choice.
Yep. You can't make a choice when you're heavy on the gas.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So another phrase that I liked was this idea of biological embedding, that the experiences early on through the gene-environment interplay shape the brain and the body. And, as they say, they bias the individual to react in certain ways to stressors that are coming both from the outside and from the inside.
Well, and there's also then your perception of threat, right? It's almost the kind of your thermometer is more sensitive, right?
So the experiences you had lead you to predict danger
where there isn't any.
Where there
right?
isn't.
You're constantly anticipating it. So the teacher who looks at the child with, a slightly frowned look, right, puts the child into action.
Yeah.
And they're picking that up. Oh, it's that pixelation research.
Yeah,
right?
on that. Yeah. Can you explain that a little bit?
You have to help me remember it. But there was I think he's at University of Wisconsin, isn't he? The researcher who took different pictures of human emotions, pictures of, I think they were adults, mm-hmm. And he pixelated them so that like they were the little squares like on your computer. Sometimes you can bring it into closer definition or clearer definition, and that children who had had histories of abuse and neglect actually were able to detect the emerging emotion faster mm-hmm. than children who had a more typical, less abusive or maltreating upbringing. So that they were kind of anticipating it faster than the kids who didn't develop in a threatening environment, which is an ingenious experiment.
Yeah.
To get at that.
But I remember it was the negative emotions that
right,
faster.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, and then we can imagine from what we were just thinking about that then the adrenaline starts.
Yep.
And then 10 minutes later, the whole HPA axis.
But your whole lens,
yeah.
Before that, is on alert. It's already skewed to it, right? I mean, that's what's really interesting about that.
Well, and it also makes it, we start to think about on a home visit or in a classroom what set a child off. And when you're thinking the way you've just described, that you're on alert to pick up hostile intimations, not even things that have happened, but things that might happen, or internally generated things, that for a teacher or a home visitor or a parent to try to figure out what set the child off is exponentially more difficult.
Yeah, and then you think about things like the number of kids that fall out, like at transitions, right? And then what that's signaling to the child is that change. We have to go from here to there, right? And that some children seem to cope with that fine. Other children have lived in more stressful circumstances. All of that uncertainty, right, is putting them into this kind of heightened mm-hmm. physiological state of what's coming next, and any little thing in there, even just that change of rooms or change in teacher that day, right?
Yeah.
Throw them into a really hyper-aroused state.
Or even if it's positive. We've seen that too. Just the arousal, the feeling of arousal is triggering.
Yeah, so why wouldn't you want to go on the field trip or going to the zoo? That's going to be fun. Fun is secondary.
Yeah.
Right? Fear is first.
Fear is first. Arousal is immediate. Yeah. And the same with the parents. Mm-hmm. If they were these kids, the idea of something changing is incredibly agitating. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, well, so here we are talking about gene and environment interplay. So there is this, I couldn't find the author of this particular phrase, but I found the phrase all over: genes or genetics load the gun, lifestyle pulls the trigger. Mm. And the idea that it's taken a long time to get into our culture, but I think is now getting there, that it isn't just our DNA, not just our genetic blueprint, but it's how we experience life that dictates when and how genes are turned on and off. And that these effects can occur at the molecular level, and that they are reactive to stress, that stress changes epigenetic markers.
Just I'm wrestling with that word lifestyle a little bit. I think I know what he means. I mean, living conditions or something, or circumstances, or I think the more we think about this and understand it, sometimes I think we equate the lifestyle piece as kind of a choice. And certainly people are making choices, although often their choices are efforts to kind of tamp down their physiology, right? So my smoking habit isn't just that I'm addicted to nicotine, but I am really trying to use that drug to regulate my physiology, right? And then we're going, well, why don't you just quit smoking? I wish I could quit smoking, but my physiology is set at such a point that it's very difficult for me to do that.
Yeah.
So that it invites all these addictive kind of behaviors that we have lots of judgment about, but that are really masking this kind of altered physiological state.
Well, I'm really glad you said that. I actually read the quote quite differently.
Okay.
In my mind, I'd already translated it to our earlier thing about environment includes relationships.
Right, right.
I didn't even actually notice the word lifestyle, and I'm just glad you brought it up.
I just think I put it in quotes, like, you know, that lifestyle choices.
Yeah. No, I
and
just missed that. But I
make it it sounds much easier, I think, than it is, and then we get impatient or angry or upset at people who are making those choices. And some degree as an adult, there's some kind of conscious awareness of that, perhaps, but that then the task of overriding your own physiology is much more difficult than most imagine.
And then that piece that you were saying earlier on about the prefrontal cortex, the brake and the pedal. One of the phrases that people use is top-down judgment and bottom-up judgment. Top-down being from the prefrontal cortex down, and bottom-up being from the amygdala up, from the reactivity.
Yep. Or who was it that wrote the book recently, The Fast and Slow Thinking? That's another phrase I've heard it. Yeah.
Fast and slow, yeah. Or hot and cold is another one.
Yep.
Red and blue is another one. Yeah. So all good metaphors. Yeah. So just another thing to think about is that when we're talking about the gene-environment interplay and how the brain changes, so there were two ideas that I just thought might be useful for us to think about. One is that one way that the brain changes is by creating more and stronger connections in the neurons. That apparently, from what I was taught as a student, and I think Scott was too, we were taught that you're born with your brain and then it's all downhill after there. And that just isn't true. But one of the things that increases is the strength of the connections in the brain. So if you're learning a new skill and you practice, the connections grow stronger. Literally, the neuronal connections go stronger. But what doesn't continue to happen over the lifespan is is how many connections are made. So the idea that as the person that I was reading said, from one person shouting to a stadium, that can only happen in early childhood. And so you can create a stronger connection with the one person later in life, but you can't add people. You can't add, So just another way to think about how we have a certain critical period for certain kinds of changes in the brain, and for others, it's lifelong. So just another way to think, another quote, another way to think about it. It's as if experiences confer a signature on the genome to authorize certain characteristics and behaviors and to prohibit others.
So a signature being like on top of,
Yeah.
right? Like on the surface of. Yep.
Yeah. To authorize, right? So you will develop these, but these you won't. Which is actually the definition of epigenetics is on top of the gene. So that's kind of lovely.
Yeah, signature is a good metaphor, yeah.
Yeah. So then the last piece to think about, not the last, but of what we're going to be talking about in terms of physiological stuff today, is the prefrontal cortex. So it is the last part of the brain to fully develop. And one interesting idea about this was that because it's the last, it's also more affected by environment because it's had more time for the environment to get in the way of what's, the earlier parts, the cerebellum, for instance, just comes online. The brainstem comes online.
Yep. Which again, it makes you think a little bit about our evolution, right? That there's a reason for that, right? There's a lot of important learning that's going to happen. This other stuff will hardwire in early. You got to have that, right? You
got to breathe,
right? That's good. That's hardwired. And then what? But then it made you think about those diagrams again at the Center for the Developing Child. They've got when do certain things come online, and why would we evolve in this way, right? Where there's this vulnerable period, right? Where you're going to have to learn a lot.
You're going to have to learn a lot.
Really important. Pay attention.
Yep.
I mean, literally our development is built that way. Our evolutionary development is built that way.
And the idea being that, given that we're a social species, we're supposed to be protected for a long time, so that the brain can fully wire.
Yep. And you're going to learn a lot about these relationships, right? There's going to be this is important learning for how things work for you.
So we were talking about this bottom-up rather than top-down control. So the condition of stress means that the amygdala activates stress pathways, which evokes high levels of hormonal release, impairs the development of the prefrontal cortex, but strengthens the amygdala, which sets up a cycle of it continues to send out hormones. The prefrontal cortex continues to not be able to wire. And there were a few ideas I just wanted to make sure I said correctly. That's why I put so much text here. It's hard, at least for me, to get a grasp on all the different things that are happening. But the idea that through stress, during stress, that the brain's response switches from slow, thoughtful prefrontal cortex regulation to rapid, reflexive, emotional responses of the amygdala. The gas pedal, the hot part. The bottom-up part, because it's fast and it's wired.
Well, and it's efficient. I mean, this needs to happen now. This is overriding. It's
so, a schematic to try to get all of this in order, that the chronic fight or flight of the too much cortisol, too much norepinephrine changes the brain architecture, lowers the ability to put on the gas pedal, and speeds up the responsiveness. There it goes round and round.
Reinforcing, so again and again and again.
Scott's making his head go round and round. Yep. So repeated exposure to threatening situations can disrupt the development of the prefrontal cortex and lead to emotional problems as well as, and these are the pieces we want to keep in mind as we go, working memory, attention, and inhibitory control. Because we're going to think about how does this apply to parenting. This is laying the neural network for the adults who become parents. So this is, we heard this in the first video, talking about how excessive activation of stress has an important, there's a link to adult disease. And that over time, stress compromises the function of the immune system, increases inflammation, and leads to a whole host of common adult diseases.
I love this phrase, allostatic load. I think it's borrowed from engineering. And it's like the amount of weight. When you drive across a bridge and you see the 10 tons or that's the amount of weight that bridge span can hold. I think they borrowed that
McEwen and that group took
Yep,
that and applied it to
that phrase to think about what, when the allostatic load of stress overwhelms the physiology of the body. It's like driving a 100-ton truck over a 10-ton bridge, capacity bridge. And either it's going to break or it's going to wear that bridge down. Over time we'll have to replace it.
Well, it's interesting. And then inflammation is one of the results. It's almost like you can't keep up. Something has to spread out. Something has to.
It starts to erode the system. Mm-hmm.
So this is one of those missing links. That it was known to happen was true. We saw that in those earlier photos, the earlier slides. But how stress in childhood affects adult disease, this is one of these things that people are really researching now. So when we think about what we're all about in home visiting, it is never to imagine that home visitors are going to eliminate the stress from families. That's just not. But rather to strengthen the capacity of parents to help buffer the children, or the home visitors to help buffer the stress on the parents, so that there is an opportunity to return to baseline and not experience the bridge breaking. Okay, we got another video.
Before you start that, Carol, could we just go back to that slide, because it was making me think about something we talked about the other day in our staffing. I think sometimes we forget that it works in the opposite direction too, and that the positive relationship between a parent and child and the parent's experience of that builds the parent's resilience as well. And just thinking about one family in particular that we were talking about, where the moving of that in that direction, I think, of course it's transactional, right? It goes back and forth. But and I was talking with a colleague the other day too around similar things, where somehow as that parent-child relationship improves, the parent's functioning improves, and the anxiety begins to dissipate, or the depression begins to lift, or so it's working in the parent's direction as well. We think about it for the child, but it moves the other way.
Yeah, and the feedback loop that has to be in place for that to happen. So is it something that you talk about talking to parents about in your staff meetings? The idea that parents know or don't know about the role of parenting in helping a child manage distress?
In a more overt way, I think we're getting a little more intentional about that. But it does require naming it, right?
It does require naming it.
And as you've talked about, kind of bringing transparency to it. That's really what we're working on, and one of the potential longer-term benefits, right, of linking it in that way. Yeah.
Yeah. So as we get further along in our talk today, we've got some examples of just transparency, ways to think about this out loud with parents, so that we can really help them know that there is a whole field here about how this works. And it's not a mystery, and it doesn't require an advanced degree, but it feels like, it feels like it does, like there's something illegal about talking directly about this to families that we work with.
Yeah. I think the challenge is breaking it down and linking it to these kind of shorter-term outcomes. I think sometimes we put them too far out. They feel a little too abstract. So how do you link it to something that we've been talking a lot about this in our staffing, about kind of holding these the kind of hopes and dreams that parents have for their children, and kind of linking those in the moment
to something that
just happened there. So I remember you told me when he was born that you wanted him to be smart. When you're doing that, that's helping him learn, or that's helping him to regulate. That's going to help him do well in the classroom. That's going to help him learn. That kind of, and being a little bit more, and it's hard, how do you be nimble with that in the moment? Of kind of having those at at your fingertips so that you can name those a little bit more quickly.
And using some strategic devices to do that. I told you, I think, recently about a parent in my office where the two parents were looking at the baby, and I said something about, a long time ago people didn't know that babies had minds. And the parent looked at me and he said, really? And I mean, I don't know that that's ever occurred to that person, but my assumption that we all know that the baby has a mind, now it's on the table.
Yep.
Okay, so are we ready for the next one?
Yeah.
Okay.
We know from research on the biology of stress that negative impact of that during sensitive periods of time that's going to sculpt the architecture of the brain can have effects on learning behavior and physical and mental health.
What this is allowing us to say is that these experiences that children come across, that we provide them with in those first 3 or 4 or 5 years, provides the scaffolding. Doesn't guarantee a perfect life later on, but it, in a sense, is an insurance policy. Some experiences are more important early in life than later in life, and therefore it argues for investing in what happens in those first 3 to 5 years.
So persistent stress changes brain architecture. Let me show you this. We know that there are changes in the structure of the nerve cell that's responsible for communication, for the ability of children to respond in their world. This is a typical neuron sitting in the prefrontal cortex. This is a neuron that after it undergoes chronic stress during development, this is the way it ends up. So toxic stress results in architectural changes of fewer connections.
It's not only are they at risk for drug and alcohol dependence, but other aspects of their biology. They're at risk for depression. Maybe nobody's surprised by that. They're at risk for cardiovascular disease earlier.
It's not as though the die is cast and the door slams shut, but it will say to us, if you want to get this kid back on a typical developmental trajectory, if you wait too late, it's going to be like pushing open a 1,000-pound door instead of just having it swing open very gently, which you can do with the right early experiences. The second is, as we understand how experience affects the brain, we're in a better position to do two things: to identify as early in life as possible kids who are at risk for falling off a typical developmental trajectory. And the second is to develop interventions that target specific circuits in the brain.
There's a critical period. There's a period of time during which this profound neglect that they've experienced, right, requires an intervention and enrichment, and it has to happen within a certain period of time in order for it to have its most powerful effects.
The most important ingredient in positive experiences for young children is the responsive adult or set of adults that are there in the child's life who are helping to let that brain be excited about learning and supporting that brain's development.
In addition to trying to focus on getting to the most at-risk populations as soon as possible, and that would be before birth. If I had to just focus on dealing with the situations after birth where you have an infant or you have a toddler, that developing daycare systems where we rank them in terms of their quality, where we provide the resources to encourage them to hire the very best staff. You can't do it on the cheap. That if we start with those systems and generate systems of excellence early and apply those to the most at-risk individuals, that's where we're going to get the biggest bang for the buck.
And that if we then continue to be mindful of how experience writes on the brain, then we're much more likely to have children who wind up being successful, happy, productive citizens of society.
So one of the things I wanted to say about this is, sometimes people who are doing home visiting where it's calm feel kind of bored. And it's ironic, right? Because we're all looking to try to help kids and parents feel regulated. But then you wonder what you're doing there. And to me, that's the most that's like the sweet spot. You have a time when somebody's mind is calm and they're open to the most potent learning. It's the best possible moment to be the architect of how this experience is going to go.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So here's a question, Carol, that maybe we can slide into that context. So somebody has asked about whether practitioners find in this kind of less transparent way of talking about this, does it begin to get the parent thinking differently about not only their experience with their child, but their own experience, their own upbringing, and how do we want to think about that, or are home visitors prepared to think about that with parents?
That's a great question. Are home visitors, so let me make sure I understand, are home visitors prepared to think with the parent about the parent?
I added that on. Well, because it's a complicated conversation.
It is.
Yeah.
Well, it goes along with our other conversation about how do you learn to parent.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So for me, if I'm thinking about being in someone's home to think about parenting, I want to know how somebody themselves thinks that they learn how to parent. That kind of sets the platform around which everything else is built. If somebody says, well, and Scott, I know you know we talked about this. I often ask, were you raised by anybody?
Mm-hmm.
And the number of people that tell me no is really surprising. Mm-hmm. So when someone says no, then I say, oh, so how'd you learn to do this? And a lot of times they say, well, I didn't.
So Carol, I'm just going to ask you to go to your next slide, just so people know they're not. A black screen.
Oh.
So they know we haven't totally lost them.
Yeah, no.
While we go on this conversation, sorry. Yeah. Well, and so one of the things, and in the Healthy Families programs, that I suspect some people are working in that environment, that there's a kind of an upfront survey or assessment that's done.
Yeah.
That actually garners quite a bit of content about a parent's upbringing. And one of the things we've been trying to think a little bit more about is that opportunity right there to begin to name that as being something we're going to think about together as we work. That how we were raised will impact our relationship with our child, good and bad, and we're going to keep thinking about that over the 4 years in Healthy Families that we'll be talking about that. But again, bringing it in this more explicit way, and this dialogue then with parents about, okay, if that's true for my child, but I didn't get it, kind of holding this piece of, I think what's hopeful in it, and it goes back to that resilience comment that I think I made before about kind of watching it be beneficial for the parent, that there's something reparative, right, in learning to parent your child in a way that you wish maybe that you would have received care or experienced the upbringing or your parents' parenting of you, that has a therapeutic effect, I think, for parents. And if we can keep that in mind as well.
It brings to mind like two of my favorite phrases I find myself using a lot. One is, I'm so glad you told me, and the second one is, well, that makes a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes those two go together really quickly. When someone says, well, it wasn't like this. The things you're telling me don't fit with anything that I ever had. I'm so glad you told me that. That makes a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm.
That now we've got that on the table, that this does not fit with anything that feels right to you.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing I hear a lot is people telling me they don't want to do it the way their parents did it. And then they find themselves doing it the way their parents did it.
Right.
And especially if we're talking about these things, what people need for relationship and for growth, what they didn't get. And then we talk about that the fact that they're sitting here talking about this
is different.
Mm-hmm. Already the child is having a different experience because the parent is thinking about this.
You are trying to do different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But those are all such bright colors.
Yeah, they're real practice dilemmas.
Real practice issues.
Yeah, it's a great question.
So please give us more questions. They're really helpful for us. I'm wondering if a lot of people listening have heard about the ACEs studies, I know there was a whole webinar on it. What we did is just create some slides. We don't have to review all of the material on the slides, but just to think about that 4 or more is what is linked to serious health and behavioral difficulties in adulthood.
Well, and I think it's always worth remembering that when the CDC and Kaiser Permanente did this study, it wasn't on a clinical population.
Yeah.
This is an ordinary group of people who were enrolled in a healthcare plan. So the entire swath. So it wasn't like they were targeting high risk or low income or anything like that. This is a garden variety sample.
And the part I think that's so shocking to all of us, when you look at what the experiences are, is how many of them are, it's not unusual to have one or no parents growing up. It's not unusual to have an alcoholic in the household. In some communities, it's not unusual to have an incarcerated household member. So it's not unusual to have someone in your family that's chronically depressed. You start noticing that these are actually not so unusual.
Mm-hmm.
And then we look at the percentages for, as you're saying, for this general swath, in order to be a Kaiser Permanente member, that's somebody who is usually working and somebody who, right? These are just people who are in the community who have health care. Yeah. And so looking at how the percentages showed up was pretty astonishing. And that this was the list, the enormous list of some of them, there's not even all of them, that were associated with early childhood.
Those of you who've seen Robert Anda do this presentation, he was one of the researchers. He has a slide for every one of these.
Yeah.
Each one he can pull up and show the distribution and relationship between the increased number of ACEs and the occurrence of these kinds of outcomes.
Yeah, and so what we know is that in some ways, some cases they're 400% higher.
Yeah, every slide is like that.
Yep.
And things like teenage adolescent pregnancy and all kinds of other social issues.
And you probably know more. I had heard that this is the most robust of social research studies, that the data is the most robust.
I mean, I'm certainly not a social science researcher, but there's just something about the simplicity of it, like an elegance in the simplicity of the data that resonates with people, I think. So, yeah.
And so this was a diagram that was supposed to illustrate where the unknown parts were, the gaps, what goes between adverse childhood experience and cognitive impairment or the adoption of health risk behaviors. And that's a little bit different now, would you say?
We're closing the gap.
We're closing the gap.
Yep.
Can you say a little bit about that?
Well, one, as we already talked about, right, this kind of that we're getting clear on the neuro development, right, the brain development that helps us understand that gap there between the cognition, cognitive impairment.
So that's first.
Yep, that's first layer there. Yep.
Layer.
So we can think about that as smaller or matched up now. And then the other one is this adoption of health-related or health risk behaviors. If we think about things like alcohol use or drug use or other kind of addictive behaviors as compensatory efforts to kind of tamp down an overly hypo-aroused regulatory system.
Yeah, so this would be your lifestyle comment.
Right, exactly, right. So we're closing that gap, that these things aren't happening by choice, or they certainly are. People choose these things, but they're also drawn to them because they have a physiology that's needing some kind of tamping down, some kind of altering.
Or ramping up.
Or ramping up, right. But it's an effort to compensate for that. Those behaviors are an effort to compensate for that. And those choices then feel less like choices as they're efforts to adapt to a physiology that's feeling overwhelming or out of control.
Which we all know, right? We all know what it's like if you don't have coffee in the morning. If we happen to be.
Who hasn't had a hard day after home visiting and gone home and eaten a little more chocolate ice cream?
Right. I mean, so it's not different from that. It's just more. because we want to, I don't know, I feel like when we talk about stuff like this, just to keep on the there is no us and them perspective. Mm-hmm. We all know what that feels like, to need something for either to activate or to try to mute activation.
Yep. And we may know a little piece of that, and it gives us empathy then about someone who's trying to cope with something that's many factors more intense.
Yes, 400%
right.
more.
Yep.
Exactly. Yeah. So this is where we're going to try to make the leap between the brain physiology in childhood, what happens throughout development, and then parenting, toxic stress, and how it relates to parenting. So first, we wanted to think about what we need to parent, because it's like, what do we have to bring to bear here? We got to be able to think about the needs of a child. So right there, you've got some prefrontal cortex requirements. You have to be able to consider the feelings of a child, to put our own needs second. So the first few are really about executive functioning, to plan, to problem solve. You've run out of diapers, what are you going to do? To think flexibly, oh, I've got a napkin, I can use that, to take the child's perspective. Then we move more to the arousal part, to manage arousal in the face of things not going so well. How are you going to, a child's crying, you're worried about the neighbor next door who gets so mad at you when the child cries at night. How do you manage that arousal? How do you stay in connection even when you're upset? So you're still thinking about the neighbor, the baby's still crying, you're upset, but you still have to soothe. You have to do something and to sustain the relationship over time. And then the piece that I always think of as that feedback loop thing that you were talking about, feeling better as a result of parenting, something that maintains parenting over time, is that you get some pleasure or satisfaction from parenting.
Carol, would it be too much to think about these, trying to think of back to that gas pedal, brake pedal?
Yeah.
Amygdala, prefrontal cortex, to think about this cluster of kind of parenting capacities and tasks as nothing's either or, right? But maybe in that cluster of kind of more prefrontal related activities or capacities, I think of them as more brake than gas.
Yeah, that's right.
And requiring some, we could tie it to reflective functioning, which is a prefrontal executive functioning capacity that we know develops.
And we know develops through relationship.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But maybe isn't part of the brake mechanism for some parents struggling with a challenging child.
And then if you have had a lot of stress and it's affected, well, let's move on to the, is that okay? Let's move on to the, so, and maybe this is what you're thinking in a way, that we've got the amygdala is overactivated, so that's the gas pedal. The hippocampus has fewer neurons, and those neurons are less tightly connected, which affects our memory. But the prefrontal cortex, being the last wired, most affected by everything that's been going on, the connections are weaker, and the judgment that comes from that is less intact. So we got this bottom-up decision-making rather than top-down. And then one thing I don't think we've talked about yet is the idea of, in addition to the other hormonal systems, one of the things that's affected is the dopaminergic system, which is involved in the maintenance of parenting. It's involved in the pleasure part. If that's depleted, which the stress research certainly says that dopamine gets depleted, which is why chronic stress can lead to depression. So if the dopamine is depleted, it just decreases the pleasure in parenting. And then oxytocin may also be affected, which is a whole other thing, because the research in oxytocin is about the next generation.
Okay. So, Carol, we have a question that maybe wants us to flesh out the bottom-up, kind of top-down metaphor.
What that idea means.
A bit more. Yeah. We're throwing a lot in here, but your slides are linking it very concretely into the physiology, but in the brain physiology as well, or the.
So maybe one way to think about it, one of the slides that I didn't end up including painted the amygdala in red and the prefrontal cortex in blue. The idea being that if it's bottom up, it's coming from the hot, the red part, the emotional, agitated, aroused, overly stimulated, which affects which isn't from the judgment seat of the brain.
Yeah. I almost wish we had a diagram of the brain here, because that may be part of it too. Although there's that old, who is it, Daniel Siegel?
Yeah. With the hand.
So if people, I know it sounds a little weird to do over the webinar thing, but you have a diagram of the brain, human brain, with your hand. So if you put your hand out, I have my right hand out, and spread out the fingers, and you take your thumb and you put it into the palm of your hand, and then close your hand. That's basically a diagram of the human brain, and your arm actually becomes your spinal cord, or your
brainstem,
and spinal cord. And so that top layer is really the cortex, right? And the prefrontal cortex would be at that very front part of your knuckles. And so when we're thinking top down, that's the top part of the brain. The down part, these other kind of more primitive structures, are inside, in the interior of the brain. So when I think top down, I'm thinking almost kind of outside in, or top down. So I don't know if that's helpful to the person who asked the question, but it's those outer layers, those higher functions that are held in the cortex that have executive control over those more physiologically based kind of interior, you call that the down position, kind of down positioned brain areas.
Which they call the deep structures.
Right. You have to call it the limbic system. That'd be another way, and there are lots of different ways to kind of describe this when we're thinking about brains.
The other thing that might sound confusing to people is the term prefrontal.
Yeah,
it just means in the front of the frontal.
Right. It's
the pre part just means in the front of that part of the hand that's talking about the fingers, or before the rest of that.
All right.
So can we take a minute? Do we have any other questions?
No, that was.
Can we take a minute just to think about this oxytocin? Because it was one of those things that really just blew my mind when I learned about it, and I just want to say it out loud. So this is the idea that what we're doing with parents now, the parenting that the parent is doing to the child now, affects the oxytocin absorption. Well, let's say it's theory, but it's a little further than theory. I think it's researched in animals. It isn't known yet to be true in humans. But one idea is that it affects how much oxytocin is going to be available to that child when that child becomes a parent. And
so the system's developing during that period.
It's developing during infancy. The neuroendocrine system is developing in infancy, which supports maternal behavior in adulthood.
And that there's a physiological basis for that's driven through these hormones.
Right, which is driven, which is stimulated by the care of the parent of this generation.
You could see them studying that in rats.
Yeah, they have studied it in rats. That we know.
Yeah.
I'm hesitant to make the leap to humans because we can't. I don't know that, and this is where the research is.
Towards leading.
What people are talking about is how complicated. There's stuff about what happens during the fetal development time and how that affects us as adults, but the idea that, so as home visitors, we are directly influencing parents who are directly affecting the next generation.
Yeah. That old quote, the Alan Schroef quote about parenting comes naturally, but it only comes naturally as you experience it. Right, all the way down to the physiological level.
Right, and that's, I think, the part that we have to be thinking and not feeling discouraged by the parents we're working with. And this is likely, if the research is true, what happened to the parents we're working with, that the behavior, the nurturing they got as infants did not turn on the capacity capacities that there is some animal research about this, that the genes actually get turned on by the maternal care.
Which on a behavioral level, right, is where are you getting, is your capacity to receive pleasure in being, it goes back to our resilience conversation, right? Do you enjoy being with your children?
Yeah.
Is your brain available to receive pleasure in that way? Which links over to the chemical dependence research, right? And we know that in parents who are chemically dependent, the reward system of the brain is literally, the child is competing with for the kind of synaptic space, right? That
specifically dopamine.
Right. Around with whatever the parent's addiction is, whatever the drug is, because drugs are really good at rewarding.
Yeah.
Like kids, not so much. Kids are the intermittent reward, right? The
drug is every time.
The drug is every time, and when you're depressed or looking for pleasure or reward, where do you go? Do I go to interact with my baby? Because sometimes I get it, sometimes I don't. Or do I go for the alcohol or the chemicals where I get the return every time?
And that's why the drug researchers use that term hijacked. The brain gets hijacked because of the dopamine receptor. Plus more.
And relationship is less rewarding.
Relationship is
that's very interesting. That'll be an interesting one to watch develop in the research.
And another thing to think about when we talk about relationship as the mechanism of change, or what the home visitor is doing with the parent, we're talking on this level that if that becomes more rewarding, that becomes satisfying, the feeling of pleasure in relationship might be new, might be something that's
very novel.
And one reason why it's so hard to sustain these kinds of relationships is that it may be new.
I got to kick it out because it's so unfamiliar.
I don't have a framework for this, and I don't have the dopamine.
Right. I don't have the neuroendocrine systems to be able to have it feel rewarding.
So how do we keep that information in mind and not be discouraged? That if this is on a physiological neuroendocrine level, can change still happen?
Yeah, it's just I go back to that Charles Nelson quote. I thought it was a nice metaphor about the door.
The door, right?
So when we're working with a baby, the door is really light, and we can move it really easily. When we're working with a parent, it's that door we're really having to push hard to push against the expectations or contradict the expectations. But they're more than expectations. They're literally, I'm not feeling rewarded by my interaction with you, and we're going to have to work. We're going to work harder and more consistently and more steadily to push the door open.
And I just want to remind us all that this kind of intervention has always made a difference, whether or not we knew about the neuroendocrine stuff. So
we're back to the foundations of practice.
So this helps us, as Scott always says, the backfill to understand why it's so hard. But the work still has an effect. The work still changes the lives of babies and parents.
And at least for me, it's always helpful to know why it's so hard. Like, oh, that's why it's so hard.
Well, and for me, it's helpful to talk with the parents about why it's so hard. I have a mom I work with right now who tells me that she thinks that she's feeling connected to her baby. That's a mystery to her. Why does she not feel connected, but she thinks she feels connected? Well, it helps us understand because the feeling that has been long depleted for her.
Interesting.
So, now you have a stressed, agitated, logically compromised parent who cannot focus, remember what you talked about, take perspective, or experience pleasure. So I
rename it high-stress home visiting rather than high-risk home visiting.
Oh, I do think of it. I call it high-stress parenting. Well, that's right. But so I'm hoping that people out there are nodding their heads, going, that is exactly what we do. And sometimes we get people where it's not quite like this, which is then we feel really good at our, at our jobs. But a lot of times we don't.
Particularly the populations, at least in some communities, are being specifically targeted.
Well, and when you do the surveys,
Yeah, so we know, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
that's the purpose, right, is for them to qualify.
Yep.
And is that true for nurse-family partnership, too?
Yeah, it's a high-risk population for them as well.
And how about maternal child? The people that aren't using a protocol, is it anyone who would like home visiting, or is it higher
I
risk?
think it can be mixed in different communities, but there may be some more heterogeneous kind of populations in different programs.
So it's possible, though, that people listening are for the most part, working with families who are stressed, agitated.
And particularly families, I think, that fall into the evidence-based model.
Yeah. Okay. Well, all right then. We take a deep breath and we get to the how can you help part. So there's a lot of writing on these slides. I hope that's okay with the observers. But it's because in this case, I really just wanted to write what we truly think. You know, not bullets, not catchphrases, but what we truly think. You know, I've been thinking a lot about being bold. That parents let us in because they want it to be different. And they want help. They want us to help them help their child. They don't want us to take over. They don't want us to tell them what they're doing wrong. They want us to help them help their child. So when we can think about that and find out what that means, let them know what we can do, I think it's helpful. I think it sets a platform, a framework. And then thinking collaboratively, that I believe that every parent wants to do it better. It's just a default for me. I just choose to believe that. I don't know. I'm guessing that most of the people in the field are thinking that way too, but they don't know how. And they
forget, they maybe when the baby was born, they had a lot of hope about that.
Yeah.
And then they find themselves moving away from that.
Yep. Because then it's hard and it feels bad. And that's the part I think that, you know, we go back to the physiology for that. Why does it feel bad? But a piece that I find that is different from what I'm doing now, for what I'm doing now, is that I want to hear the ideas that parents have about how things are the way they are.
Their beliefs.
Yeah, because if I go in with my beliefs and I don't know theirs, then we're just working at cross purposes. Mm-hmm. And I feel it's my job to teach them what the right beliefs are, except that doesn't work. Mm-hmm. So to find out why people think, so they say it's because the baby's spoiled, then I want to know about that. I want to know what was in their experience, what are they hearing, so that we can think about it together. So what would we do if that's what we think, and then what do I know about recent research?
And that those are going to be in contradiction.
Those are and to say that, and that absolutely makes sense. This is what your mom does, this is what your grandma does, and here's what the research is saying, because people have been really thinking about this. So that's my next one, is share what we know.
Yeah, and there's not only the knowing it. I think if you really delve into the research, there's a kind of knowing on another level. So I think getting into those kind of contradictory, stances with parents, is it spoiling, isn't it, back and forth. So we can talk all about that belief, and then there's a point of let's try something.
Right.
And if we really we know it's gonna, if they really give it a shot, that baby's going to start crying less, right? Or the toddler's going to be less demanding if they respond more regularly, right? I mean, on a more regular basis. So there's kind of got to be this knowing in your bones.
Please, God's sake.
Right, as you're going into those it's almost, do I really believe it? Not just do I know it,
right,
but do I really believe it? And do I have enough knowledge about it, exposure to it in my own life, and the research? It comes together in a way that I think it allows you to convey it with some confidence, which I think has a lot to do then with the parent thinking, okay, I'll give it a try, or what do I have to lose?
Yep.
Or I'll humor you.
I'll humor you.
Whatever.
I'll
right.
humor
Yeah.
you. Can we try an experiment?
Yep. Yeah. So I think there's something to that.
I'm more and more about Susan McDonough's interactive guidance
Yep.
style at the University of Michigan, of observing what goes well.
Yep, and grabbing onto that.
So like in my office, I see these very young parents looking at the baby, and the baby is calm for a minute, and they're looking at the baby, and the baby's looking at them. Then I talk about what's going on in the baby's mind, and that moment when they're all just looking at each other, there's so much happening, but how would they know unless we say something?
Well, and to bring your now I think statewide quote, Carol, that's a thing right there. What just happened between the two of you, right, by you bringing it to attention means it as a thing. Mm-hmm. And we can find that thing again.
We can.
It's that, it's a good universal
and I have some
scripture.
words
like things
that have been generated by parents. We talked about the thing, and somebody gave me one. So we'll talk about that in a second. So the idea, though, that we feel like we have to show rather than tell, that you and I know that it's the way it's done. If I tell you because I'm the expert and that I know and you don't know anything, that is not effective for anybody. If I don't tell you information, if I don't share what I know, I'm also not giving you an opportunity to learn something. So figuring out how you and I collaborate.
That's the collaboration. Yeah.
Can talk about, like, look at this thing that I just read yesterday. Yeah. Here's what somebody sent me, and it's so interesting because your baby's that age, and isn't that interesting? And if they say, well, babies don't think, what are you talking about? Like, where did that idea come? I'd be very interested. I'm sure all of us have heard some parents say to us, babies don't understand until they're some age, like 3. That's an interesting idea. So I want to know where that comes from, and then we can talk about that. So interesting. That makes so much sense. Because of what you had, here's what I was just reading.
But it does mean being into that experience as a collaborator, as a partner in it.
It does. Well, and as we've long been saying, when people not in our field say, why don't you just teach them? Why don't you just tell them to feed the babies? Our answer is, well, because that doesn't work. If it worked, we would do that. But everyone learns the hard way that doesn't work. So here's another one that I've been thinking about, which is helping parents understand that just like us, babies and toddlers need help calming themselves. That when we have a bad day, we want to talk to somebody about it. So babies are just the same, except instead of a whole day, it's like minutes. So if they're having a bad minute, they want to talk to you about it, and they want you to talk back. So understanding that crying and fussing is a communication, it's minute by, it's the same kind of thing. We feel better when someone sits with us and says, wow, that was well, that's just what the baby's doing. Regulating. Needing a partner to regulate. Yeah. And then the second piece about that crying is communication. Well, we have to help ourselves and parents understand the baby doesn't know what the message is. That's our job. The baby sends the crying. Our job is to interpret it like a code. So they say something, we understand it, and then once we get it, the child learns the code too.
Only if we organize.
Only if we organize it.
Yep.
Yep. Mm-hmm. And then we translate it into something that feels meaningful. And then I think that what you were talking about, that sense of the parent gets of feeling better, when I can translate what my child needs, especially if I can tell here comes the child care provider who says, boy, I don't know, she was fussy, and you're like, oh, yeah, that's because she prefers to be swallowed.
Yeah, but there's the rewarding part, right?
Yeah.
That's the part that feels good.
Like, I know something.
Yeah.
Helping parents understand that we each create our own decoding book for each child, and that over time the code becomes easier and easier. In our typical parenting experience, it takes, 3-4 months as we learn the signals from our own babies. And then at some point there's that magic thing of, oh, that's the hungry cry, oh, that's the sleepy cry. We know what it feels like before that, where you're just kind of guessing. But then once you know the code, it isn't as hard to keep adding more
chapters.
Yeah, right. There's fewer. The kid now gets that you have the book.
Yep.
First you have to have the book. And then you have to start writing code in it. Mm-hmm. And for parents who learn that over time, it becomes easier and easier because the child looks at you and settles down before you even have to interpret anything.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, and again, Carol, it makes me think about parents who, back to your question about who raised you and saying no one, that's almost like there's no book.
Yeah.
And this isn't ever going to get easier, and I have no sense of ever really understanding this, right, that there's no possible way to decode this. And it's just interesting to think about that void when most, I think, kind of ordinary parents or parents with even kind of a reasonable upbringing have a sense of this will get better, or there's something that ahead, that a future where I can imagine this being different.
Well, you keep using the word organized. It starts to feel organized.
Yeah, but that there's going to be an arc to
There's going to be an arc,
right?
Exactly.
And that I can anticipate that. When you don't even know there's an arc, then it just looks like entirely overwhelming. Yeah.
Endless.
Yep. Yeah. Endless dread. I mean, if you're at the beginning of it and you're thinking, well, I'm going to have 20 years of this.
How is this supposed to work? Sometimes I'll hear parents say, well, my mom told me she never knew what I wanted when I was crying. That's really helpful for me, because then I do think about the book, the absence of the book. If that parent never felt decoded, what equipment do they have?
Right.
So that's where we go back to the relational thing between the home visitor and the parent, is we pay close attention to how they're, if they agree, but they say, well, yeah, I can do that, and they pull back and you say, wait, that's...
So let me try to work a question into this book metaphor, Carol. So somebody has written in a question about adoption and a phenomenon that they've noticed in their practice of adoptive parents who were adopted themselves as young children, having their own children and becoming involved with child protection and losing parental rights, having the parental rights terminated, and wanting to think a little bit about that phenomenon. That's a great question. So when we put it back to this book idea, I don't know, just play with this for a second. Might that be like that those first few chapters of the book are ripped out?
Yep, didn't get sent.
And then you start writing the book. The child's adopted at 6 or 7 or 8 or 5, but those really early pages, or maybe
5 months. Nice.
Or well, I was thinking years, but it could be earlier than that.
Oh, thinking years.
Yeah, those are big chapters.
Those are big.
But even that, like,
even 5 months,
right. And there is research about timing of adoption and later outcomes that I think should give us all pause a little bit. But it's this kind of book metaphor, right, of those early chapters being missing, and you can write all of that, but something happened, on page 1,
right?
That set the story a little bit, and that nobody can find, or wasn't shared, or wasn't disclosed,
or nobody knew.
Or nobody knew, right?
So sometimes we get kids who are adopted from institutions. There wasn't a code book.
Yep.
So then or another one that I hear are people who are coming from other countries where the code, maybe they were cared for, but now they're in a different language system, different food system, different.
Or somebody else has that part of the book.
Yeah.
Right? That was the caretaker in the orphanage, right? Who the child was really connected to and removed from at 3, right? And they have the first 3 years of the book, but it doesn't transfer to the new parent.
So the thing maybe that's embedded into the question is the phenomenon that you and I have observed with parents who were in foster care or parents who were adopted. The early beginnings, the roadmap is missing, the internalized roadmap for parenting. What we start to see unfolding is what they had or didn't have, which they can't make sense of. If they were adopted or if they're taken out of foster care at 2, and then after that they're raised in a home, why couldn't they do it? But they didn't have the book from birth to
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So it is something that we talk about a lot. Is parenting is internalized, involuntary, unconscious. It unfolds when you have a baby. And nobody tells us that our history will move in our front door when we have a baby. And then you find yourself either doing or not doing. trying, somebody makes a comment like, why are you doing, don't you pick up the baby, or why do you hold the baby all the time, right? That's all us. That's the internal part of us.
Yeah. It's a good metaphor.
Okay, so another piece we want to help parents understand is that they are unique to their child, and that what they're creating is a thing between them. So I think about kids who go to child care as babies. So they have a code with the parent. Both of them know the code. Now here comes the really great child care provider who picks up the baby. The baby doesn't know this person. The child care doesn't have the code book. So these are temporary disruptions, right? That with a very attuned child care provider and an adjusted baby, it doesn't take long, but we know what that looks like when the baby makes a certain sound. But the child care provider doesn't have that book. It means something else to them until they figure it out. So it can, but for the parent to know that they're creating something unique between the two of them.
Yeah. Well, and I think about the child's experience in that case too. Oh, I know I'm bumping against time, but also kind of depending on the age of the child, that over time they're internalizing a sense that they're co-authoring.
Yes.
And that even when people don't get me at first, they'll get me.
Yep.
Right? We'll figure out a book and we'll write a new
see those kids who have that presence
that looks so robust and kind of intact.
Okay, so the thing that Scott was referring to, help parents understand that there's a thing that happens that connects them to each other. So what we know is if parents didn't have the thing, they don't know it exists. They think parenting is about feeding and clothing and keeping them out of the street, taking them to school, but they don't know that there is supposed to be a current. So my new favorite comes from a client who called it an electrical current between parent and child. So I've been playing with the word current, but I've also heard or used elastic band, emotional conveyor belt, invisible string, whatever works for you. But the thing that, whether you are a paraplegic or a person who has full use of limbs, keeps your child from running out into the street. It's a thing that connects the child to you. And we feel that what it's like to try to create that thing with our clients, our adult clients, who I also call the tug of, well, I don't need more metaphors. But when you try to connect to the parent and the parent doesn't pick it up, the parent hasn't had the experience versus somebody who has and is responsive. So much of the work is helping somebody feel what that's like to be in relationship with somebody. So that we do that with parents so that they can understand that that's the thing that we're trying to help them do with the child. They don't know it exists.
And that's that parallel process,
yeah,
right, of doing to and with the parents so they can do to and with the child.
And putting it, seeing if you're comfortable, moving it from the experiential level to the verbal level. That's the hard part. So what I've been doing lately, right now I'm picking up something to throw at Scott. So can I throw this at you?
It's not anything big.
But I do this with parents. I throw a very soft foam ball back and forth, and then we talk, and I say, how do you know how to do this? And they always laugh. And they say, well, because I've done it before. And I say, oh, how'd that happen? And then, so we talk about that there's throwing and catching, and a pattern that we both know how to play because we've both done it before.
Right.
So we have just a few, okay. So this is just a summary. We talk about these words, but just to think about, that's all we're talking about. Just that was in text versus in bullet points. Regulation, reflection, relationship. Right? They are embedded into what we do. But whenever you're wondering when you're on a home visit, what am I doing? Am I doing anything? For me, I go back to these 3 R's, and I think about reflective functioning, regulatory partnering, reciprocity, and relationship. And if those are happening, even if they're thwarted, they're still on our minds that this is what we're trying to do. Yeah. Also called the professional use of self. How we are is the instrument of change. So I'm just going to go quickly because we want to take the last few minutes just to talk about us, you guys. It's contagious. If you're in the field, either without enough support or for too long, or you have too many of the really, really high-stress families. So how do you know? Well, you know, some of this stuff you can't find the balance. You can't recover. You can't...
The homeostasis.
Yes. How do you get back to homeostasis? So we got some risks. You know, we have the same kinds of effects of becoming forgetful, having high arousal. We do that hot decision-making, you know, that impulsive kind of bottom-up stuff, and that depletion of dopamine can make you feel like, if I'm in the wrong field, who was I to think I could make a difference? Nothing ever changes, so we get overload and burnout and at risk for traumatization, really. So, you know, my favorite is when us, the home visitors and the other professionals listening, show up to work sick. That's just my favorite, when somebody's just sneezing all over us and we say, like, you know, well, I can't afford to miss work. We're saying that we are trying to teach parents self-care. But so how many of you guys, how many of us have shown up to a meeting with parents not feeling well? Right? But we can handle it because, you know, we're the professionals. So ours just seem more necessary or legitimate. So we just got a list of self-care ideas. Yes, they're kind of, I don't know, obvious or hokey or whatever.
Reminders. All good reminders.
But they're reminders. Yep. So no reason to go over it. It's printed. It'll be on your handout. But just to think about, what can you do realistically? Can you do a handful of them realistically? We don't want to make promises to ourselves that aren't going to be kept, because that just leads to more disappointment. But just think about what you can do and what you can do with your team.
In small little bits.
Small bits. Small bits. And then there is a list of resources. Oh, yep, there it is. But I want to just let you see this one.
Directly.
Mm-hmm. Is he doing what he's doing?
Oh, he's moving.
Oh, he's moving. I hope you guys see that he's clapping. Whoa. So we just want to thank you for attending. Please give us feedback, because it helps. It helps to decide the topics and the methods. And we appreciate you taking your time.
Thanks, Carol. It was fun.